Record.
Um,
All right. So when you're ready, I'm ready. Okay.
I'm ready.
All right. Hey, Jen, good to see you.
Hey, Deb, it's good to see you.
I'm so excited about this idea. Like, it's been so long since I found a new person to play with in the area of sexuality and arousal and fantasy and all of that. So I was just so excited to meet you.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this conversation since we booked it in a few weeks ago. You do a lot of great, juicy work, and I love how we a lot of our underlying work is the same, and we just come at it from like different sexy angles, I think.
Yeah.
So
Oh, I love it. Sexy angles. So to each of our audiences, we just kind of wanted to introduce each other to our audiences. And maybe we can start by Jen, you just saying who you are and what you do and how you help people. And then I'll go next.
yeah, my name's Jen Wadke, and you can find me at my website, jenwadke.com. Um, I am a pleasure and orgasm coach. So I primarily work with women who come to me, often not directly for sex and pleasure related things. There's usually like something underlying that, but it feeds into often their enjoyment of their sex life, and they kind of want more. I think a lot of women know that there's more out there for them in the realm of sex and pleasure. So I help them find new pathways into their pleasure and their sexuality. And one of my absolute favorite things that I've just recently started teaching is this concept of touchless orgasm. So, yeah.
I love it. I love it. So, okay, fantastic. So, for your audience, Deborah Lukovich, and I have a PhD and master's in the field of depth psychology, think Jungian psychology, which is the study of the unconscious. So, my clients come to me for a lot of reasons, but I would say, bottom line, it's about breaking out of limiting and conventional ideas about everything. So people, my clients and people, my listeners and watchers, they're objectively successful on the outside, but there's this angst on the inside about the systems that they have to operate in. And, some of my clients are business owners and entrepreneurs, and they're trying to figure out how to do business in a different way, or what does it mean to be a good father and husband? And then also there's so many limiting ideas about how to be in relationship, right? And also, like, I wrote a blog post called maybe it's not about, what if it's not about finding the one, right? Like, what if it's about finding the one for now, and then there's another the one, right? So so you're helping people break out of these limiting ideas that are stifling them, and it's hard to do that on your own, right?
Yeah, I mean, as a coach, I also love being coached. And I know all the tools and practices and what have you to teach my clients and to take them through, when they're going through private sessions. And I can do some of that myself, but when somebody expert is guiding you, like they are making connections about things that you've said and experienced and are sharing that you can't see. It's so hard to look at ourselves objectively. So it's so awesome when you have somebody there to help guide you deeper into yourself. And I think what you said, one of the things you said off the top was about that subconscious.
Mm-hmm.
That's my favorite place to play. Like, what else is in me? What else is under there? Like, what's going on? I think we all have like these really sort of unplumbed depths that, make us who we are. And when we go in and play in there, and sometimes I think of it like down in the muck of who we are, once we
Mm-hmm.
start playing in there and digging some of that out, we can have this like amazing trajectory of expansion and recreating and reinventing ourselves and becoming truly alive and truly whole. So
Well, you just called on the lotus flower metaphor, like the muck, right? It grows out of the muck, and then you actually did this like the opening lotus flower, which is the feeling of enlightenment, which isn't just, intellectual, right? The Kundalini experience is about starting at the roots, where we're grounded, and then through all the chakras. And so the spiritual orgasm is really coming into deeper relationship with our self, capital S, which is also the bridge to the transcendent, whatever that means to you. So that's like mind blowing, right? You don't even need another person for that. So anyway, we'll talk about touchless orgasm, but why don't we start with what we are trying to do is speak to each other's audiences. Like, what is something that comes up in your work? And I think maybe you want to talk about fantasy, but what comes up in
Yeah.
your work that that I might bring a depth psychology perspective to?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I am a huge fantasizer myself. And I have a lot of differing kind of thoughts about how fantasy should play in my life, how much I should
Hmm.
let it play in my life. And I
Oh.
know for me, I don't have any, like my fantasies, whatever. I'm like, I'm down in the muck with them. It's like, this is only in my head. I'm fine with that. I know that it's not reality, and I know that I don't have an impulse to act
Mhm.
on most of these. But I do know that for a lot of people, in regards to their fantasies and even more generally to their sexuality, there can be a lot of really deep underlying emotions of like shame and guilt and embarrassment. So I just wonder how that shows up in your work and how you help
Yeah.
people feel about.
Yeah. So it's funny that it took me really a long time to realize that. Okay, let's take a little, we'll edit that out. Get your butt out of here. All right. Uh, it took me, speaking of shame, like I'm a little embarrassed that I didn't really understand that we don't create fantasies, we receive them. Right. So fantasies, spontaneous fantasies come out of the unconscious. So right there, don't feel bad. Like I remember during a phase of my midlife unraveling and reconstruction when I had a submission fantasy that wouldn't leave me alone. And the fantasy, it was like in my bedroom, and there was a particular man standing naked, and I was kneeling, and it just wouldn't leave me alone. I was in the middle of a business meeting, and I was like all getting aroused, and I'm like, oh my God, go away, go away, go. No, like, oh, I'm in a business meeting. What do you? So we don't create fantasies, we receive them. Now we can write scripts and we can imagine and sort of have our minds like we can direct a little bit. So, that's the first thing not to feel bad about is that there's a deeper meaning to the fantasy that it represents it's symbolic. And sometimes there is a need to literally act something out. So, for example, my fantasy, the way that I came to find the deeper meaning of it is I decided to draw it. So I Googled, how do you draw a naked man standing with an erect penis? And there was a image I could draw. And then I Googled, how do you draw a naked woman kneeling, looking at the naked and looking at the penis, the erect penis. And as I drew it, I ended up writing receptive. So for me, this was a time in my life that I was needing to surrender to the mysterious workings of my inner self. And so it was about submitting not to a literal man, although I have another thought about that too. So at the same time, I was doing some online dating and I was on OkCupid, and for some odd, and back then you could answer all these questions about sexuality, what you're into or whatever. And I was like, I don't really know. Right. And randomly this man emailed me. I hadn't reached out to him at all. And he had this whole like theory about why successful, powerful women want to be subs, want to be submissive in the bedroom. And he said, well, it's because they have to walk around like being independent and control to prove that they are, they are worthy of being in the workplace, that they just want to let go at some point. And at the time I was like, you're annoying. Don't pretend you know me or women. But he was kind of right. So like at the time I was like, you know what? At the end of my marriage, I felt like I was keeping everything together. And I would say to my former husband at the time, like, when do I get to fall apart? Why do I have to keep everything together? So you can see like that one fantasy is, yes, was sexuality, was sex was kind of part of it, but it had this deeper meaning that had to do with surrendering when I had, had all these protective mechanisms, and my persona was very strong. I wasn't vulnerable to the outside world. Now I am. And so that was how I found deeper meaning in that particular fantasy. So I love the topic of fantasies.
So would you almost say that a fantasy is just a waking dream in some ways?
Yeah, yes. In that, the images that are presented to you can be explored just like dream images. So you look at like, what are my associations with this image? And for the concept of submission, think about it, to submit. So people misunderstand that submit is not passive. You
Mm,
choose to receive, or you're being forced. Then you're not receiving, you're being assaulted, right? So to receive is active, to submit is active. So
and
yeah.
I think another thing that I think people get wrong or maybe misunderstand about the concept of submission is that it's not a position of disempowerment. Choosing
Yeah.
to submit, as you said, is very empowering.
Yeah.
Um, and we allow women the space and the freedom to submit, and sometimes on broader scale, we expect women should submit.
Mhm.
And I think it's really unfortunate that we don't allow men the
Mhm.
same space culturally that we expect women to do that. So I think there's some really
Yeah.
engendered expectations around that. But
Absolutely. And actually, before I ask you my question that comes up with my audience is, I recently had on my podcast Mark Beneteau, who wrote a book that I bumped into in 2016 called As Lovers Do. And it's one of the most beautiful books on sort of relationship that I have ever read, because it talks about the masculine and the feminine inside. So the masculine isn't gender, right? The masculine is like a way of
yeah,
navigating, of approaching life, right? It's linear, it's uses reason and the intellect, and the feminine is the meandering, is creative, right? Like the masculine doesn't create, it brings form to the chaotic creation of the feminine. So those two things, so it's about being fluid. And he makes room in there to talk about, like, yes, sometimes men in sex, literal sex, want to be in a submissive position. They want to be able to surrender to something. So he just talks really beautifully about sort of psychologically and emotionally what is going on. And then again, like, yeah, literally sex that goes on, but it also is about the rest of our lives. What is our relationship? Are we fluid with our masculine and our feminine? Do we feel, men are more emasculated by other men not to be vulnerable and not to sort of,
yeah,
bring out their feminine than women are. So, yeah. So
yeah.
what comes up, I think, for you to talk to my listeners, sometimes I can be a little bit too much in the symbolic, right? And not be literal enough. So, women especially, but men do too, have a weird relationship with pleasure, right? Because we have this sort of the Christianity, let's just say Christianity got involved in this, and actually the what Christianity is today and how some people interpret the doctrine is not really true. There were feminist voices way at the very beginning of the writing of Christian doctrine. And if you actually sort of look at Jesus, he really is a great combination of the masculine and feminine, even if you look at him physically, right? It's really interesting. But so we have this warped, and I have another book. I'll put the link in the description box. It's Rian Eisler's book, Sacred Pleasure. So she kind of goes through the history of, what happened when we sort of decided that pleasure wasn't good, and that instead we are going to sacralize suffering instead of pleasure. And then of course we were going to put it all on women to do the suffering, right? And then men, of course, were supposed to be afraid of that's why men want to control women's bodies, because they're afraid of what the power that women have over them, all that kind of stuff. But anyway, so maybe just talk to my audience about pleasure, and like that's such a big topic right
Yeah,
there.
huge. I love that you and I are having this conversation today. It was interesting just yesterday or the day before, I woke up with just this, like, I was thinking about my clients and thinking about what I had been teaching, and just had this, like, I just put it all, I just had a realization where it all came together into a succinct thought, where when I'm talking to a client when she's just come in and we're going through, where she wants to be in her sexuality versus what she's experienced. And when we get into the conversation of orgasm, it's so fascinating to me that most women, not all women, there are some women who certainly are pre-orgasmic across the board, but more common, I hear women saying, oh, I can orgasm by myself, but not with a partner, common experience. But what always floors me after that is typically the next thing out of her mouth is, but it's okay. Like, I still love sex. Like, I still have a good time.
Oh.
Like, women are
Oh.
constantly just accepting that they just don't get to have the same orgasmic experiences as men. Like, it's just accepted.
Hmm.
And they want to make sure that that they're still enjoying, they're still having a good time. And I don't work a lot with men, but I don't know. It seems to me that if a man can't orgasm, he's like going to the doctor ASAP. And this is a problem that needs to be fixed immediately if he can't orgasm during partnered sex. And I just think it's really interesting how so many women have this paradigm where they just accept that, like, just doesn't happen with a partner, or it's harder with a partner. And I think that's where my passion lies. It's like, we need to change
Yeah.
that acceptance, that
Yeah.
broad cultural acceptance that women have, that, like, oh, ours isn't as important. Like, I don't come to with my partner. Like,
I think it's also like women, of course, well, women can be really mean to women and men, of course, but I think sometimes, well, what comes up for me are those times when women pretend, right? And why do they do that? Because, well, some younger women don't pretend. They're like, they're more honest than maybe people of my generation, but it's like you feel bad. So, here's what's coming up for me during my unraveling and my online dating period. I was together with a couple of men, and it was as if it was a curriculum for me to learn how to come into deeper relationship with my own body. And I remember being with this one man, and and he was just kissing me, and then he moved down to that area, and I love that. But I told him, I said, you know what, I think I have I have performance anxiety. And it wasn't about, like, it didn't have anything to do with him. It had to do with, like, how long it might take him to pleasure me until I orgasmed. That's like warped, man. Like, right. So I'm the one who felt bad. Like, it was my responsibility if I couldn't orgasm because of what he was doing.
I think that's such a common experience. Like, I've had those experiences myself where someone's going down on me. I'm like, oh my God, I'm taking too long. And then you get into your head, and I would,
Instead of just saying, hey, why don't you move a little this way or do a little, like,
right?
why can't we do, some of us do
Right.
that?
Yeah. And I think, and I mean, I would never shame somebody who's faked an orgasm. Like, I understand why that happens.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think when you zoom out from that a little bit, I think it just seems that women, even in the bedroom, are playing to men's egos, right? Like,
Yeah.
you don't want to be
Yeah.
mean. It's almost like, I don't want to be mean and not have an orgasm when he spent, 30 minutes going down on me.
Right.
Like, that's not how it works.
Yeah.
And that kind of, like, in our head thinking, and this is one of the main things I do in my one-on-one individual coaching, and something that we also really work on inside of the touchless orgasm course. You have to get out of your head, right? If you're thinking, I'm taking too long, or do I taste funny, or oh my
Yeah.
God, you're not enjoying what can happen in your bodies. And I think this is so common amongst women, coming back from what you said earlier about how we've moved out of that sacred feminine. Women have lost touch with the sacredness of their own bodies and their
Yeah.
pleasure and the receptive capabilities that they have. And even going back to what you said about chaos, like that resonated too. Like sometimes I feel like I have that chaos flowing in me, but if I'm thinking about it, I can't connect with it. I can't feel it. I can't enjoy it. I can't direct it. I can't use it to bring myself to orgasm.
Yeah.
So,
So you're helping them get out of the mind
yeah.
and into the body
Yeah.
and quiet. So is your touchless orgasm, I love that, is really about them coming into better relationship with their own body and their own sexuality, which then automatically is going to allow them to have a different experience with a partner if they want to have
Yeah.
a partner. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. There's sort of three main chunks. So we spend some time really focusing on body sensations. A lot of us have become numb to our body's
Yeah.
wisdom and to pleasure. So we just spend a lot of time just focusing on what do I actually feel in my body, what's actually happening. Then we do a bit of pleasure building where we start, once we've connected with that pleasure, we start working on expanding it and circulating it and what can I do with it. And then there is the mind piece where the mind piece is really getting out of the mind, right? Getting underneath what's there.
Yeah.
So whenever anybody does any of this work, I always get a comment like, oh, this belief popped up I didn't know that I had, or I was masturbating and all of a sudden I remembered, something from my childhood where my dad said, bad girls don't do this, whatever.
Yeah.
So we also really do a lot of work with that piece because until you have to have all three of them, right?
Mhm.
Like you have to have that body sensitivity, you have to have the ability to connect and control your pleasure, and you need to know what's underneath it that's blocking you. So we do all three of
Yeah.
those to
Absolutely.
the new
Yeah.
pleasure.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think we can just kind of round this off. I love it. I think we can round this out with their, sexual attraction, sexuality is a life force,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
Right. Like you don't really make yourself aroused or feel attraction. It's so mysterious. And there is a hidden purpose to it. And one of the things that that we were talking about before is, fantasies. So for example, I remember the moment that I discovered that, that arousal was not about sex, literal sex. And I was having a conversation with a colleague that I really respected. We were both community leaders and we love getting together and chatting. We were having a beer at a bar, and suddenly I'm feeling aroused. And this is a man, he's just a colleague and he's married and right. And so I'm like, why am I feeling aroused? And I had this conversation in my head while I was like, like pretending like I'm trying to figure this out because I'm like, what is going on right now? Why do I feel aroused? And in my head, I'm going, am I attracted to him? And then I imagine kissing him and I'm like, no, so why am I on fire right now with arousal? And it was because of what we were talking about. So I get aroused intellectually. And so an idea. So if you think of like, creative intelligence flows through us as arousal. And the deeper meaning, besides it's fun, pleasure, right, is that it's seeking to create, it's seeking to express something. So two people, and I think often male female friendships, we talked about this on during my podcast with about authentic relating with Mark Beneteau, the same author, is that, males often a friendship, whether it's another woman or two men or a man and a woman, where there's arousal, there's this immediate, we're worried about it. Like, I can't be aroused around him. I know his wife. And so sometimes we misunderstand what the attraction is. And one of the things that people can do is when they're in that situation, they can wonder about like, what does that person represent for me that is speaking very deeply to a part of me that's trying to come out and be intimate with me. So one last thing, when sex dreams are rarely about literal sex, they're about becoming intimate with yourself. And so often you'll have a really weird sex dream that you feel shame about. And what that really is that there's something about yourself that's trying to grow a new part of yourself, but there's shame attached to it. So it's not even about sex at all. Your psyche's just calling on this sex act to produce this feeling of shame and to help you understand that there's a part of you that you don't have a healthy relationship with, and it wants to be intimate with you. So, yeah. So, well, this has been great as a little intro to our audiences, and just to let all of you know, we're actually going to have a longer chat. And I would say, subscribe to both of our websites and reach out. And if you have any particular questions that you might want us to discuss, that'd be cool.
Yeah, and I know I offer free calls on my site too. If anybody's hearing this and is like, oh,
Yep.
but love more about
Same.
Jen. Yeah, we both do. So absolutely head to both of our websites and schedule in a time to talk to either one or both of
Yeah.
us. Because
Yeah, or take advantage of whatever our free resources are.
yeah,
So,
totally.
so Jen, this has been great. And I look forward to having a longer chat and seeing where we might meander when it comes to sexuality.
Thank you for having me. It was so great to catch up. And I feel like we just started scratching the surface here.
Oh,
So for this conversation.
for sure. Definitely. Okay. Well, take care.
You too.